My name is Rachel Monroe, and if you've ever watched your life collapse in front of people who swore they loved you, you'll understand what I'm about to say. 8 years ago, I was 24 and convinced that passion could conquer fear. I'd built a startup in Seattle called PulseLink, a little AI app that could read emotions in music. For a while, it actually worked. Investors smiled. My parents bragged at dinner parties. I thought I'd made it. Then, in less than 3 months, it all fell apart. A competitor launched a similar product. Our funding evaporated overnight. The headlines disappeared, the calls stopped, and so did my parents' pride. When I told them I was drowning, $90,000 in debt, rent overdue, one step from losing everything, my father looked at me across the table and said, "You made your bed, Rachel. Lie in it." My mother didn't even lift her eyes from her phone. That was the night I realized love in our family came with conditions. They didn't just abandon me, they erased me. Photos vanished from their social pages, invitations stopped. I became the family ghost no one mentioned. At 24, I was sleeping on an air mattress in a damp apartment that smelled like wet concrete, trying to convince myself this was just a phase. But it wasn't. It was exile. And betrayal, real betrayal, doesn't scream. It whispers. It seeps into your chest until silence becomes heavier than anger. I tried to stay busy, coding, emailing, pretending I still had clients. But the truth was, I was terrified. My friends stopped calling. My parents pretended I'd moved away for personal reasons. Betrayal hits different when it comes from blood. It cuts clean and leaves nothing to sew back together. If you've ever been shut out by your own family when you needed them most, drop your story in the comments below. This space, right here, is for people like us, the ones who've had to rebuild from nothing. And don't forget to subscribe, because what happens next in my story will make you question everything you thought you knew about family. After that night, I stopped calling home, not out of pride, but because I couldn't stand hearing my mother's voice switch to polite small talk, as if we were strangers at a networking event. I spent that winter surviving on cheap noodles and borrowed Wi-Fi from the cafe downstairs. I'd wake up to rain sliding down cracked windows, Seattle's gray sky pressing against the glass, and I'd whisper to myself, "You are still here." Every line of code I wrote felt like a prayer for redemption. Every rejection email, a reminder that I'd fallen farther than I ever imagined. But here's the thing about losing everything, it strips away the noise. You start seeing people and yourself for what they really are. My parents had always cared more about appearance than connection. They curated their lives like an Instagram feed long before Instagram existed. And when I stopped fitting their aesthetic, they deleted me like a bad post. I didn't know it then, but that silence, the absence of their approval, would eventually become the loudest truth of my life. Because family, I'd learn, isn't who shares your last name. It's who shows up when everyone else walks away. Stick with me, because this story isn't about revenge. It's about revelation. It's about what happens when betrayal doesn't destroy you, it defines you. Seattle winters have a way of getting under your skin. The rain doesn't just fall, it lingers, clinging to everything like regret. That winter, regret was all I had. I lived in a one-bedroom apartment with peeling paint, the kind of place where you could hear your neighbors argue through the vents. The fridge hummed louder than the city traffic outside. I'd stack unopened bills on the counter and promise myself I'd face them tomorrow. Tomorrow kept not coming. I pawned my MacBook, then my camera, then the last piece of jewelry my grandmother had left me, a thin gold bracelet that used to make me feel like I still belonged somewhere. My father hadn't called since that dinner. My mother sent one text, "We hope you're making responsible choices." That was her version of compassion. Each day blurred into the next. I woke up to the sound of rain and the constant anxiety that maybe this was it, the end of everything I'd worked for. People I once called friends slowly disappeared. It started with polite excuses. I've just been so busy. Then came the ghosting, the silence, the kind of avoidance that feels like being erased from a group photo. I'd scroll through social media, watching their lives move on, weddings, vacations, promotions, while mine stood still. The loneliness was so heavy it felt physical, like carrying wet clothes that never dried. The only person who didn't vanish was Naomi Ellis. She worked at a coffee shop downtown, slinging lattes to tech guys who looked like my old investors. Every few days, she'd slip me a free muffin or an extra coffee and say, "You don't owe me, you just need a break." Naomi had been with me from the early PulseLink days, when we thought our app would change the world. She'd seen me code until dawn and believed in me when no one else did. One night, I met her after her shift. The cafe was almost empty, the smell of espresso hanging in the air. I told her everything: the debt collectors, the sleepless nights, the way my parents acted like I never existed. When I finished, I expected pity. Instead, she leaned forward and said quietly, "You're allowed to be broken, Rach, but don't you dare stay there." Her words hit harder than any investor rejection, because they were the first words of belief I heard in months. Still, belief doesn't pay rent. The next morning, the electricity flickered out. I sat in the dark, surrounded by silence thicker than the rain outside. My phone buzzed with a message from a number I didn't recognize. Another debt reminder. I didn't even open it. I started walking every evening just to get out of my own head. Through Capitol Hill, down Pike Street, past people laughing under neon signs. I'd watch couples hurry inside restaurants, and I wonder what it felt like to belong again. I remember one night in particular. It was cool enough that my breath came out in clouds. I stopped at a crosswalk and saw my reflection in a store window. Messy hair, tired eyes, a woman I barely recognized. That's when the tears came. Not the cinematic kind, but quiet, embarrassed tears that sneak up on you when you're just too tired to hold them back. When I finally got home, I wrote a note in my journal. "You're still here." That's something. It was such a small sentence, but it kept me alive. I started to realize that loneliness isn't just being alone, it's being forgotten. It's when the people who taught you what love was decide they don't need to love you anymore. Naomi kept checking in, sometimes showing up with takeout or a secondhand sweater she just happened to find. She reminded me I still had value, even if my parents didn't see it. And slowly, a tiny spark began to form beneath all that pain. A stubborn little thought that maybe this wasn't the end. Maybe I could still build something new, even if no one believed in me yet. But before that spark could grow, life was about to test me harder than ever. Anger doesn't explode all at once. It builds quietly, in the corners of sleepless nights, in the way you clench your jaw when someone asks, "So, how's your family?" By spring, I'd stopped pretending. The shame that once felt like a bruise turned into a burn, constant, sharp, impossible to ignore. One afternoon, Naomi sent me a photo she'd found online. It was my mother at a charity gala in Bellevue, wrapped in pearls and smiling beside a banner that read, "Empowering Young Women in Tech." I stared at it for a full minute, heat rushing up my neck. This was the same woman who wouldn't return my calls, the same woman who told people I'd chosen a risky path. My father was there too, shaking hands with donors, looking every bit the proud parent of a daughter who didn't exist anymore. That picture broke something open. I realized they weren't ashamed of me. They were ashamed of what my failure might do to them. I started hearing things through distant relatives, how my parents told everyone I'd moved to Europe to find myself, or that I'd stepped away from technology for personal growth. They were rewriting my story like I was just another marketing pitch. The lies made me furious. Not because they hurt, they did, but because they made my struggle invisible. They took the years I'd worked,
the nights I'd slept under flickering monitors, the courage it took to chase a dream and turned it into a footnote of embarrassment. There's a particular kind of rage that comes from realizing your pain has been repackaged as someone else's reputation. I wanted to confront them, to walk into one of those charity dinners and tell everyone the truth, that while my mother was handing out scholarships, her own daughter was scraping coins for instant noodles. But what would that do? They'd just call me dramatic, ungrateful, emotional. So instead, I turned my anger into work. I started freelancing, taking small contracts, web design, data cleanup, whatever paid enough to keep the lights on. Every project I completed was a tiny rebellion, proof that I could still stand without them. Still, at night when the city went quiet, the anger came back. I'd picture my father's calm, detached face, that expression that said, "You're on your own now," and my mother's silence, more cutting than any insult. They had turned love into a transaction, and when I ran out of value, the account closed. Naomi told me once, "Some people can't handle seeing you fight for something they never had the courage to chase." She was right. My parents had always worshipped stability. The house, the cars, the spotless Christmas cards. My risk, my ambition had threatened that illusion. But their rejection had lit something fierce in me. I stopped chasing approval. I stopped apologizing for dreaming too loud. For the first time, I began to think, maybe I didn't lose my family. Maybe I escaped them. And yet, part of me still ached for their validation, the child in me that wanted to hear, "We're proud of you," just once more. That contradiction, wanting justice, but craving love, it's what kept me awake most nights. Because when the people who raised you become strangers, you don't just lose them, you lose the version of yourself that believed you were safe. I didn't know it yet, but life was about to take everything one step further, to strip me down until anger was all I had left, and then hand me the one person who would change everything.
It happened in late autumn, the kind of gray Seattle season when daylight feels borrowed and everything smells like wet pavement. By then, the anger that had once fueled me was fading, replaced by something worse: numbness. I was behind on rent again. My freelance gigs had dried up, and every email I opened seemed to start with, "Unfortunately." The landlord taped a notice to my door: 7 days to vacate or pay in full. 7 days. I sat on the kitchen floor that night, the lights turned off to save electricity, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room. There were 3 cans of soup in the cupboard and $42 in my checking account. It hit me then. I had nothing left to pawn, no favors left to call in. For the first time in my life, I felt completely disposable. I tried calling my parents, even though I knew better. The number rang twice before my mother's voice came on, not live, but the chirpy recording she used for strangers. "You've reached Elaine Monroe. Please leave a message." I hung up before the beep. That silence, that cold, practiced silence, broke me. I wrote them an email instead, short, desperate. "I don't need money. I just need to know I still matter to you." The message bounced back. She'd blocked my address. I laughed out loud, that hollow kind of laugh that sounds almost like choking. Then I cried until I fell asleep on the floor. When I woke up, morning light leaked through the blinds like thin knives. I remember thinking, maybe they're right. Maybe I am the failure they said I was. The next few days passed in fragments. Microwave dinners, long walks in the drizzle, avoiding the landlord's knocks. Each step down the hallway felt heavier, like gravity had doubled. Even Naomi's texts started to pile up unanswered. I couldn't keep pretending I was okay.
One afternoon, as I sat staring at a disconnection notice from the power company, my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "Rachel, this is Robert, your uncle. Naomi told me what's going on. Can we talk?" I hadn't spoken to my father's older brother in years. He'd always been the quiet one at family gatherings, the guy who left early and brought books instead of gossip. I almost didn't respond. Pride, shame, exhaustion. But something in me cracked. We talked that night. His voice was steady, grounded. He said, "You don't have to explain, just tell me what you need." I told him the truth, the eviction notice, the debt, and the feeling of being erased. He listened. No sighs, no advice, just listening. When I ran out of words, he said, "Pack your things. I'm driving up tomorrow. You're not doing this alone." I didn't believe him until the next morning, when an old silver Jeep pulled up in front of my building. He stepped out wearing a faded flannel and a kind smile, holding 2 travel mugs of coffee. "Come on," he said. "Seattle's not good for your soul right now." I stood there shaking, unsure whether to cry or collapse. Then I grabbed my 2 suitcases, everything I owned, and followed him downstairs. The 6-hour drive to Portland was mostly quiet. We listened to the rain slap the windshield, the tires hum against the highway. Somewhere near Olympia, he said, "You know, kid, sometimes losing everything is how you find what's real." I stared out the window at endless gray clouds and wondered if he could be right. When we reached his house, it didn't look like much, a 1-story place with a porch light that flickered, the kind of home that smelled like coffee and old books. But to me, it felt like oxygen. That night, lying on his couch with a borrowed blanket and the faint sound of rain on the roof, I realized something. The world hadn't ended. It had just gotten quiet enough for me to hear who still cared.
Robert's house wasn't big or fancy, but it was alive. Bookshelves lined the walls, a record player sat by the window, and a soft hum of jazz filled the air. The kitchen smelled like roasted coffee and lemon soap, a scent that somehow made me feel safe for the first time in years. He pointed to a small guest room with a clean bed and said, "Stay as long as you need. Your family." That word, family, almost undid me. It had been years since I'd heard it spoken without conditions. Over the next few days, I learned that Robert ran a small IT consulting firm from his garage. "Nothing glamorous," he joked, handing me a mug of coffee, "but it keeps the lights on and the brain busy." When he found out about my background in tech, he offered me a position helping with project coordination and client support. I hesitated. I didn't want to feel like a burden again, but he waved it off. "You're not a charity case, Rachel. You're rebuilding. There's a difference." That became our motto: rebuilding, not begging. The first week was chaos, learning new systems, catching up on client deadlines, trying not to drown in self-doubt. But Robert's way of teaching was patient, almost surgical. He'd walk me through spreadsheets, explain invoices, or pause during a coffee break to say, "Numbers don't lie. Learn to read them, and you'll never be fooled again." Slowly, my confidence began to return. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was learning again. My world, once shrunk down to unpaid bills and disappointment, began to stretch open. Naomi came to visit one weekend, bringing homemade cookies and her usual sarcasm. She plopped onto Robert's couch and said, "Look at you, corporate woman. I'm impressed." Robert chuckled from the kitchen. "She's more than that. She's running half my business now." I rolled my eyes, but I couldn't help smiling. It felt strange. Laughter. Lightness. Like remembering a song you loved but forgot how to hum. In those months, I started paying off small debts. $50 here, $100 there. Every payment felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. Robert and I worked late some nights, the two of us huddled over glowing screens, sipping cold coffee. He'd tell stories about his early days in tech,
Deals gone wrong, lessons learned the hard way. Sometimes between lines of code, he'd look at me and say, "You've got grit. Don't lose that." One evening, as rain tapped against the windows, he coughed mid-sentence. It was deep, rough. He brushed it off with a small wave. Just a cold. But it wasn't. A few weeks later, he was diagnosed with heart disease, advanced and aggressive. The doctors said he'd need to rest, slow down. But slowing down wasn't in Robert's vocabulary. So I stepped in, managing meetings, handling contracts, keeping the company afloat while making sure he ate something other than black coffee. He'd grin and say, "You're spoiling me," but I could see the exhaustion behind his smile. Despite everything, he never lost his humor. One night, sitting by the fireplace, he told me, "You know, when your dad and I were kids, I thought he'd be the one people admired. Turns out, it's you." The words hit me like sunlight through clouds. We sat there for a long time in comfortable silence, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. I realized I wasn't broken anymore. The failure, the betrayal, they were still part of me, but they no longer defined me. I'd found something purer than success. Peace. The kind that comes from knowing someone believes in you without asking for proof.
Robert passed away on a Tuesday morning in early spring. The sky was too blue for grief. It almost felt wrong. The house smelled like coffee and medicine, the silence pressing against the walls. I sat by his bed long after the nurses left, holding his hand until the warmth faded. Losing him felt like losing the last thread tying me to family. But even through the heartbreak, there was peace, because Robert never made promises he couldn't keep. A week later, his lawyer Claire Jensen called. "Robert left a detailed will," she said. "He wanted you to be here for the reading." I didn't expect anything. I thought maybe he'd left me a few keepsakes, his old record player, a couple of books. What I didn't expect was the knock on my door that morning. When I opened it, my parents were standing there. It had been 6 years since we'd spoken. My mother still wore pearls. My father still carried that same calm superiority that used to shrink me. They looked around the porch, assessing everything. The fresh paint, the porch swing, the car in the driveway. "Rachel," my mother said softly, "we're so sorry about Robert. He was a good man." Her eyes flicked past me, scanning the living room like it was a showroom. My father cleared his throat. "We thought we should come pay our respects and talk about how Robert's estate will be handled." There it was, not even subtle. I invited them in, mostly out of disbelief. My mother's perfume filled the air, foreign and heavy. They talked about family unity, about doing what's fair. Every sentence was wrapped in fake warmth, but I could hear the greed underneath like static. When they left, Naomi, who had stayed with me through the funeral, just shook her head. "They smell money, Ratch, that's all this is." I didn't want to believe it, but deep down, I knew she was right. The next day, we met at Claire Jensen's office in downtown Portland. The room was quiet, lined with oak bookshelves and soft light. Claire sat behind her desk, papers neatly stacked, expressions steady. "Robert Monroe's will," she began, "is clear and legally binding. His estate, including his business holdings, property, and financial assets, will be transferred entirely to Rachel Monroe." The words hung in the air like thunder. My mother's mouth opened, then shut. My father's jaw clenched, a vein throbbing near his temple. But Claire wasn't done. Robert also left a personal letter to be read aloud. She unfolded a single page. "To Rachel, my chosen daughter, you proved your strength when the world turned its back. You earned every piece of this legacy through resilience, compassion, and integrity. To Michael and Elaine, when I needed support years ago,
you called my work a fantasy. When Rachel needed family, you turned away. My estate goes to the one who chose love over pride. This is my final word." For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the ticking of Claire's wall clock. Then my father slammed his palm on the table. "This is outrageous. He can't just cut us out like that." Claire didn't flinch. "He can, and he did. His will is airtight." My mother turned to me, tears balanced perfectly in her eyes. "Rachel, you can't really mean to keep all of this. We're your parents." I stood, hands shaking but voice steady. "You stopped being my parents the day you blocked my calls, and Robert was more of a father than you ever were." Naomi, who had stayed with me through the funeral, whispered behind me, "You tell him." My mother's mask cracked, her voice turned sharp. "After everything we gave you?" I interrupted. "You gave me conditions. Love isn't a contract, and you broke it first." Claire closed the folder. "This meeting is over." My parents stormed out, muttering about lawyers and justice, but there was no justice left for them to buy. Later that night, Naomi and I sat on the porch, the Oregon air cool and clean. She scrolled through her phone and said, "Do you mind if I share your story? People should know what really happened." I hesitated, then nodded. Her post went live the next morning. They called her a failure when she fell. They called her selfish when she stood up. Now they call her lucky, but the truth is, she earned everything alone. It went viral within hours. Old acquaintances, coworkers, neighbors, all saw the truth. My parents, who had built their lives on reputation, watched it crumble in real time. Their friends stopped calling, charity boards quietly distanced themselves. I didn't celebrate. I didn't post a single word. Justice didn't need my applause. It had already spoken. Through Robert's will, through the silence that followed, through the look on my parents' faces when they realized they'd lost not money, but the daughter they once dismissed. For the first time, I felt free. Not victorious, just free.
3 years have passed since that day in Claire's office, yet I still remember every sound: the ticking clock, the rustle of paper, the quiet gasp when the truth finally landed. Life looks different now. I run Northbeam Solutions, the company I built from the foundation Robert left behind. We design software that helps small nonprofits manage their donations. Nothing flashy, just something that makes people's work easier. The office sits in the same Portland neighborhood where Robert's garage once buzzed with servers and ideas. Sometimes I'd catch myself pausing at the window, coffee in hand, watching the rain trace lines down the glass. For the first time in years, the sound doesn't sting, it soothes. There's a framed photo of Robert on the shelf beside my desk, him holding a coffee mug mid-laugh. I talk to him sometimes when the office is empty. "Still learning from you," I whisper. And somehow I swear he'd be proud. I never reconnected with my parents. They sent letters, carefully worded apologies that read more like press statements than remorse. I didn't respond. Forgiveness doesn't always mean reconnection. Sometimes it means protecting your peace and walking away, quietly, permanently. Instead, I started something new. A mentorship program for entrepreneurs who've lost everything, the same way I once did. Every week, I meet someone sitting across the table, eyes tired, voice shaking. They tell me about dreams gone wrong, about families who turned away. And I tell them, "You're not done. You're just at the part of your story where you learn who you are." Last month, a young woman hugged me after one of those sessions. She said, "You make me believe I can start again." That sentence, more than the money, more than the company, felt like real success. Robert used to say, "Family isn't who shares your blood. It's who shows up when you're bleeding."
I didn't understand it back then, but now I live by it. Sometimes betrayal doesn't destroy you, it refines you. It burns away everything false until only truth remains. So if you're listening, and any part of this sounds like your life, if you've been cut off, dismissed, or made to feel small, remember this: you are not their mistake. You are your own recovery. And if this story hit home, drop a comment below. Tell me who showed up for you when no one else did. Because maybe your story, like mine, is just beginning.